When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart didn't skip a beat out of fear, but because I knew he'd find the messages. The ones I had meant to delete. The ones I had sworn to myself would stay hidden forever. I lunged to grab the phone back, but he was quicker. His grip tightened, and his eyes never left the screen. I watched his expression twist and darken line by line, and I felt the walls of my life begin to crumble. Yes, he was about to discover the truth. But not all of it. His hands were trembling now as he scrolled further, closer to that one message. The message that could blow everything apart. Or maybe, just maybe, only make it worse. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in his hands. A new notification popped up, and I saw his face turn pale the second he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit I'd carried since childhood whenever I was nervous. My nerves tangled with the horror of knowing what I had done. His breathing quickened, I could hear it from across the room. This was it. The moment I had dreaded more than anything. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. The kind that rewires everything. And now, I had no idea how to fix it. But maybe if I tell you everything, truly everything, you'll understand how it happened. Before I share the secret I've been hiding for so long, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, and answer this: have you ever had a secret you tried to bury, only to realize it had already started to surface? He didn't used to leave without saying goodbye. That morning, I sat at the edge of the bed, my hand still warm from where he had slept, and stared at the half-empty space beside me. He was gone, again. No note, no kiss, not even the sound of the front door closing. Just silence. It wasn't new, but it still stung like the first time. You get used to someone leaving in pieces. You just never get used to how hollow it makes you feel afterward. The house always felt colder when he wasn't in it. And maybe that had less to do with temperature and more to do with presence, his absence echoing through every corner, loudest in the kitchen, where he used to hum while brewing coffee, and in the hallway, where our jackets once brushed shoulders as we walked out together. I boiled water for tea and realized we hadn't shared breakfast in over a year. I sipped in silence, the clock ticking above the sink like it was mocking me. I wasn't lonely because I was alone. I was lonely because I hadn't been seen in months. There's a difference. The sky outside was pale, almost colorless. It felt fitting. I pulled on my cardigan and opened the front door, needing air more than anything else. The mailbox was empty, of course it was. Just like yesterday. And the day before. As I turned back, I nearly collided with him, my neighbor. He was holding a small paper bag and looked just as startled as I felt. "Oh," he said, smiling. "Didn't mean to scare you." "It's fine," I replied quickly, stepping aside. "I, baked too much banana bread," he said, lifting the bag. "Thought maybe you'd like some." I hadn't spoken to him in months. We usually just nodded in passing. But something about the gesture, or maybe the quiet in his eyes, made me pause. "Thank you," I said. "That's kind of you." He hesitated, then added, "Happy birthday." My chest tightened. I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't expected anyone to remember. My husband had forgotten, it wasn't even worth being angry over anymore. But this stranger with a bag of banana bread, he had remembered. I took the bag and gave him a thin smile. "That's unexpected." He shrugged. "Sometimes the unexpected is good." Back inside, I placed the bag on the counter like it might explode. The smell of warm banana and cinnamon filled the air. I hadn't baked in years. I used to love baking. But somewhere along the way, I stopped doing things that made me feel warm. That made me feel anything. Tucked inside the bag was something else, a small paperback. The cover read, Loneliness in Marriage, a Study of Two Silences. I stared at the title for a long time. Was it a joke? A message? Or just coincidence? I opened to the first page. There was an inscription in small, careful handwriting, You deserve to be seen. My throat tightened. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at those words. They felt intrusive. Kind. Dangerous. All at once. I should have thrown the book away. Or laughed it off. Instead, I took it upstairs, placed it on my nightstand, and left it there like a wound I didn't want to look at but couldn't cover up. That evening, I waited for my husband to come home. He was late. As usual. I reheated leftovers and set the table for two, even though I knew we wouldn't eat together. At 9:30, he finally walked through the door, talking on his phone, gesturing something at me that meant, I'll be done in a minute. I nodded, though he wasn't looking. I sat down to eat. Alone. He never noticed the bag on the counter or the book upstairs. When I climbed into bed that night, he was already asleep. Or pretending to be. I lay there in the dark, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator and the louder echo of thoughts I couldn't quiet. I reached out, fingers brushing his back, but he didn't stir. I pulled my hand away. Maybe that was what intimacy had become, one person reaching, the other asleep. The next morning, I didn't wake to his kiss or his whisper. I woke to silence. Again. I showered, dressed, and made tea. When I opened the front door, the cool air hit me like a splash of clarity. I needed something. Movement. Meaning. Contact. I didn't even know. That's when I saw him again, the neighbor. He was sitting on the porch steps next door, coffee in hand, eyes meeting mine with a calm kind of question in them. I looked away. Then back. I nodded. So did he. And that was the beginning. Or maybe just the first thread that would later unravel everything. The days that followed felt suspended in a kind of quiet tension, like the air before a summer storm. I tried to tell myself that nothing had changed. That a polite exchange on a porch, a loaf of banana bread, and a book with a thoughtful note didn't mean anything. But the lie sat in my chest like a stone, unmoved by logic or habit. My husband continued to drift in and out of our home like a ghost. He was there physically, eating, sleeping, occasionally commenting on the news, but emotionally, he remained unreachable. I watched him more than I spoke to him. Studying his routines, the way he rubbed his eyes when tired, the way he glanced at his watch during every meal. He never asked me what I did that day. He didn't notice when I changed the bedding or rearranged the living room. I was invisible in my own house. The book remained on my nightstand. I hadn't opened it again, but its presence haunted me. I would catch myself tracing the edges of the cover absent-mindedly before falling asleep. It was irrational. It was only a book. And yet, it felt like a doorway to something I had sealed off a long time ago. 3 days after our brief encounter, I was in the kitchen when I heard a soft knock on the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and deliveries usually just left parcels on the step. When I opened it, he stood there, my neighbor, holding a small toolkit. He gestured toward the driveway. Your husband mentioned the kitchen faucet's been leaking again. Said I could take a look while he was at work. I stared at him for a moment, unsure how to respond. He was dressed casually, dark jeans, a gray t-shirt, sleeves pushed to the elbows. He looked comfortable, unhurried, like someone who didn't live in the rush of other people's expectations. I stepped aside. Of course. Come in. The sound of his footsteps on the hardwood felt louder than they should have. He moved through the space easily, like he'd been in the house before, which he had, years ago, during a neighborhood barbecue when everything still felt whole. As he bent under the sink, I busied myself wiping the counter, though it was already clean. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the soft metallic clink of tools. I could feel his presence behind me like heat from a distant fire, faint but impossible to ignore. After some time, he stood and washed his hands. Fixed. Just a loose valve. I nodded. Thank you. He turned to leave but paused at the doorway. I hope the book didn't offend you. I looked up sharply. No. It didn't. I just wasn't expecting it. It reminded me of you, he said simply. Not in a bad way. There was nothing in his tone that suggested anything improper. And yet, the sentence lingered, charged with a kind of unspoken recognition. I didn't know what to say. So I said nothing. He left without another word. That evening, I set the table for two, even though I knew we wouldn't eat together. My husband came home late again, kissed me on the cheek without meeting my eyes, and went straight to the study. I sat alone, picking at my food, my thoughts restless. Later that night, I stood at the window in the dark, watching the soft glow from the neighbor's porch light. I could see him through the curtains reading, a mug of something warm in his hand, shoulders relaxed. He looked present. Like he was truly in his own life. And I felt, for the first time in years, that I wasn't. The next morning, I found myself lingering by the mailbox longer than necessary. Part of me hoped to see him again. The other part was ashamed of that hope. But he didn't come. And life continued in its quiet, aching rhythm. 2 days later, he sent a message. It came through the neighborhood contact app we all used for community updates, lost pets, lawn services, local events. A private message. Short. Precise. If I crossed a line, I apologize. I respect you. I just think you deserve more than silence. I stared at the words for a long time before typing anything. My fingers hovered over the keys, deleting and retyping the same sentence over and over. Eventually, I sent. It wasn't the book. It was what it reminded me of. That once, I used to feel seen. His reply came a minute later. You still are. I closed the app and turned off my phone, my pulse in my throat. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, thoughts spinning, emotions clawing at my chest. It wasn't attraction, not in the way people usually mean. It was something quieter. Deeper. Like two people recognizing the same wound in each other. The following afternoon, I stood in my bedroom, staring at the closet. I don't know what possessed me, but I pulled out a dress I hadn't worn in years. It was simple, navy blue, soft fabric, modest neckline, but it clung to my figure in a way I'd once liked. I hesitated. Then put it on. I did my hair. Applied light makeup. Looked at myself. I looked like someone I had forgotten. And I hated how that realization made me feel. As though everything I'd lost had been a choice. A slow surrender. That evening, I walked to the little park a few blocks away. I didn't plan to. My legs just kept moving, the way they do when your heart's too full and your home's too quiet. He was there. Sitting on the bench beneath the oak trees, reading the same book. Our book. He looked up as I approached. No smile. Just a calm acknowledgement. I sat beside him. We didn't speak for a long time. The breeze rustled the leaves overhead. A child's laughter echoed from a far end of the park. Somewhere, a dog barked. Finally, I said, I don't know what I'm doing. His gaze didn't waver. Neither do I. And then, without warning, without planning or excuse, we turned toward each other. We kissed. Not hungrily. Not desperately. Just a quiet, aching press of two mouths that had forgotten what tenderness felt like. It lasted only a moment. And then I stood, heart hammering, breath uneven. "I have to go," I whispered. And I did. I walked home without looking back. My palms sweating. My thoughts racing. Inside, the house was silent again. My husband wasn't home yet. I undressed slowly, folded the navy dress, placed it gently back in the closet like a secret. Then I stood in the middle of our bedroom, hands shaking, and asked myself the one question I didn't want to answer. What had I just done? But I already knew. The following morning began like any other, but nothing about me felt the same. I woke before sunrise, eyes already open in the dark, listening to the distant hum of a car on the street, the creak of old wood shifting with the changing temperature. My husband's side of the bed was empty again. I reached over, touching the cool sheet, wondering when exactly that absence had stopped surprising me. I moved through the house in silence, barefoot, each step feeling heavier than it should. In the kitchen, I poured water into the kettle and watched the steam rise, curling toward the ceiling like smoke from something quietly burning. My hands moved automatically, cup, tea bag, lemon, but my mind was elsewhere. Stuck in the park. On the bench. On that moment. We kissed. Just those 3 words. Small, ordinary words. But in the context of my life, they didn't feel small. They felt like a fracture, one that split down the center of everything I thought I could still control. I hadn't seen him since. No messages. No accidental meetings. I didn't know what I wanted, and the silence was both a relief and a torment. I kept telling myself it hadn't meant anything. It was just a lapse. A moment. But then I would replay it, how natural it had felt, how unforced. How it had opened something in me that I thought was long dead. I sat at the kitchen table, tea cooling in my hands, and tried to push the thoughts away. But guilt doesn't listen to logic. It arrives uninvited and lingers like smoke on fabric, unseen, but never unnoticed. Later that day, I went into the city. It was a spontaneous decision, made simply to avoid the weight of the house. I wandered through the art museum alone, pretending to care about the exhibits, trying to let my thoughts be pulled outward. But every quiet corner, every bench, every fleeting glance from a stranger only reminded me how inward I had turned. I felt like someone observing my life from behind glass. I stopped at a small cafe before heading home, ordered a salad I barely touched, and stared out the window as rain began to fall. People hurried by, shielding themselves with jackets and umbrellas. I envied their purpose, their movement. I felt like I was floating, untethered, uncertain. Back home, the first thing I noticed was that the book was gone from my nightstand. At first, I thought I'd misplaced it. I opened drawers, checked the floor, lifted the bedspread. Nothing. Then I saw it, on my husband's desk, face down. Opened. Moved. My throat tightened. My hands went cold. He had read it. Or at least noticed it. Which might be worse. I waited until after dinner to ask. He had come home earlier than usual, which was rare. He seemed distracted, not angry or cold, just elsewhere. During dinner, he picked at his food, eyes drifting to the window every few minutes like he was expecting someone or something. I didn't bring it up. But as he was rinsing his plate, I finally asked, carefully, "Did you see the book on my side of the bed?" He nodded without turning around. Yeah. Interesting title. I waited for more. There was none. I wanted to ask what he thought of it. Whether it felt like an accusation. Whether he saw himself in the pages. But I couldn't form the words. They caught in my throat like thorns. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the rain as it tapped the windows, wondering how much more space could grow between two people without either of them moving. By the third day, I couldn't stand the silence anymore. I wrote a message. Just a few lines. Nothing emotional. Nothing revealing. Do you regret it? I hesitated before sending it. Then I did. I put the phone face down and walked away, pacing the hallway with restless energy. 5 minutes passed. 10. 15. The reply came, no. But I know we should. That was all. I stared at the words, heart beating harder than I wanted to admit. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't complicate things further. But the fact that he had replied at all meant he was thinking about it too. And that alone was dangerous. The next day, I ran into his mother at the grocery store. She was kind as always, chatty, unaware of the storm beneath my skin. She mentioned that her son had been quieter than usual, asked if I had noticed anything. I lied, said I hadn't. Smiled politely. My heart was pounding the entire time. As I pushed the cart through the aisles, I caught sight of myself in a freezer door reflection. I looked tired. Older. But something in my eyes surprised me. There was a flicker of defiance? Of life? I wasn't sure. But I noticed it. When I got home, there was an envelope tucked under my front door. No name. No stamp. Just folded paper with my name written in neat script. I opened it slowly, hands trembling. It was a note. I see you. I don't want to make this harder for you. But if you need someone to talk to, I'm here. No expectations. No judgment. Just here. I read it twice. 3 times. Then folded it carefully and placed it inside the book on my nightstand. That night, I stood in the bathroom, brushing my hair, staring at my reflection. I thought about the woman I used to be, before the years dulled her, before habit replaced intention. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. But I was beginning to realize that something inside me was waking up. Something I had buried under years of compromise and silence. And that terrified me. Not because of what might happen, but because of what already had. I didn't answer the note. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. How do you respond to someone who says, I see you, when you've spent years training yourself to go unseen? The paper sat inside the book for 2 days, folded neatly between chapters one hadn't yet dared to read. I would open the cover, glance at the curve of his handwriting, then close it again like it might burn me. And in some ways, it already had. Each day passed slower than the last. The routine of my life hadn't changed, morning tea, folded laundry, forgotten conversations about bills and weather, but I had. Or was changing, quietly, like leaves under snow, reshaping without making a sound. I wasn't sure if it was a beginning or a break. My husband noticed nothing. Or if he did, he didn't ask. He had been coming home later again. I didn't mind. It was easier not to pretend. On the 4th morning after the note, I found myself back at the park. I told myself I needed the walk, that the air would clear my mind, that I would avoid the bench where we'd last sat. But my feet moved with a memory all their own. And before I knew it, I was there. The bench was empty. I sat anyway. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that made everything look older. I watched 2 teenagers throw a frisbee across the field, their laughter ringing out like it belonged in a different life. I used to laugh like that. I think. Though I couldn't remember the last time. After a while, I stood and began to walk. I didn't know where I was going until I was standing at his front door. I didn't knock. I stood there for what must have been a full minute, heart pounding in my ears, fingers twitching at my sides. And then I turned away. But the door opened behind me. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We looked at each other in silence, and I saw it, the question in his eyes, the restraint, the understanding. It wasn't a moment charged with desire. It was something quieter. More human. "I'm sorry," I said, finally. "For what?" His voice was low. "For showing up. For not knowing why I did." He stepped aside. "You don't have to know." I didn't go inside. I couldn't. But I stood on the threshold, and we talked. About nothing. About weather and books and how the seasons felt shorter lately. It was the kind of conversation you have with someone when you want to say everything but are afraid of what it might mean. Eventually, I left. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. The further I walked from his house, the more I felt the weight of it again. The weight of choices, of silence, of a life that no longer fit. That evening, I opened the book. I didn't read it all. Just one paragraph. It said, "Loneliness isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of being known." I read it again. And again. Until the words blurred and tears stung my eyes. I didn't cry, not really. But I felt the pressure of it behind my ribs, the kind of ache that comes from truths too long ignored. Later that night, my husband sat beside me on the couch. It was rare. We both watched something on television, something neither of us really cared about. I could feel him beside me, his presence familiar but distant, like a photograph hung in the wrong house. During a commercial, he cleared his throat. "You've been quiet lately." I turned toward him. "So have you." He nodded, like he knew what I meant and didn't want to admit it. The silence returned. Louder now. When I went to bed, I didn't wait for him. I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering how two people could share so many years and still feel like strangers. I remembered our first apartment, the late-night conversations on the floor with cheap wine and better laughter. Where had that gone? Who had we become? The next morning, I wrote a message. "Thank you. For the note. For seeing me." I didn't expect a reply. But it came. I always did. "You just stopped looking back." That stayed with me. All day. Through cleaning and errands and the awkward half-smiles exchanged with neighbors. I kept returning to those words, "You just stopped looking back." Had I? Or had I learned to stop expecting anything in return? That evening, I stood in front of my closet, pulling out a coat I hadn't worn in years. In the pocket was an old movie ticket stub. A date night we never repeated. I ran my thumb over the faded print and wondered when we had stopped making memories and started managing time. I went for another walk. Not to the park this time. Just through the neighborhood, past houses with warm lights and front porches, past the familiar mailbox where I'd once smiled at banana bread and kindness. When I returned, the house was dark. My husband was working late again. I stood in the entryway, coat still on, and listened to the silence. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I played music. Softly, from the old stereo in the living room. A song we used to dance to in the kitchen. The notes drifted through the air like dust caught in sunlight. I closed my eyes. Let myself remember. Not him. Me. Who I was before the silence. I didn't dance. But I let the memory wrap around me, just for a minute. And when it ended, I turned the music off and went upstairs. The book was still on my nightstand. I opened to the place where his note was folded. This time, I wrote one of my own. Not to him. To myself. Asterisk, you are allowed to want more. You are allowed to be more, asterisk. I placed it beside his. Two truths. Pressed between pages. Waiting for whatever came next. It was a Wednesday when it happened again. A quiet, unremarkable Wednesday, the kind you'd forget if not for what it came to mean. The day had started normally, with overcast skies and the usual weight in my chest. I went about the morning in silence, folding laundry, wiping counters already clean, putting on makeup not because I needed to, but because I needed to feel like I still had control over something. My husband had left early again, muttering something about a client meeting and a late lunch. I didn't ask questions. I no longer knew whether I was avoiding the answers or simply tired of asking. We had become experts in coexistence without connection. A well-rehearsed play with forgotten lines. That afternoon, I saw him again, my neighbor. We crossed paths outside, both collecting mail we probably didn't care about. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered a fraction too long. We hadn't spoken since the last note. Not directly. Not face to face. The air between us still carried the memory of the park, of the bench, of the moment our silence broke into something else. I didn't know what I expected. Closure? Clarity? Maybe just acknowledgement. Instead, he nodded. I nodded back. We both turned to leave. Then he said it. Would you walk with me? I didn't hesitate. That scared me more than anything. We didn't say much at first. We just walked, past houses we both knew, past gardens beginning to dry from the late summer sun. There was a calmness to it. Not the kind that relaxes you, but the kind that warns you something important is forming beneath the surface. Eventually, we stopped at a quiet corner where the street bent into a cul-de-sac. He turned toward me, hands in his pockets, voice careful. You haven't asked me why I gave you that book. I looked at him, unsure how to respond. I had wondered, of course. But asking felt like opening a door I didn't know how to close. I didn't want to assume anything, I said. You wouldn't have been wrong. I stared at him. The honesty in his face unnerved me. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it was rare. Because it had been so long since someone had looked at me like I mattered. I wasn't trying to push anything, he added. I just recognized something in you. Something I know too well. That was all he said. And I knew. I knew he had seen it too, the hollow routine, the way we go through life without ever really feeling it. I wanted to thank him. I wanted to walk away. I did neither. Instead, I asked, do you think it's possible to come back from that? From feeling unseen? His answer was soft. Only if you let yourself be seen again. We parted there. Not with any ceremony or promise. Just a gentle, almost unnoticeable moment of stillness. But something inside me shifted. That evening, I made dinner. Not just reheated leftovers or ordered takeout. I cooked. I sliced vegetables, marinated chicken, lit a candle on the table, not for him, not for romance, but because I wanted to feel like a person again. Like someone who cared enough to make space beautiful, even if no one noticed. When he came home, my husband paused at the doorway, eyebrows lifting just slightly. Did we have something to celebrate? He asked. No, I replied. I just felt like cooking. He didn't press further. He ate, complimented the flavors, scrolled his phone between bites. I tried to hold on to the flicker of satisfaction I felt. It faded quickly. Later, while washing dishes, I noticed something on the windowsill, an old photo of us, tucked behind the curtain, collecting dust. It was from our 10th anniversary, sunlight, wine glasses, his arm around me. I couldn't remember who had taken the photo or what we talked about that day. I stared at the frozen smiles, wondering if that couple still existed somewhere underneath all the time and silence. That night, I went upstairs before him. I didn't want another empty hour beside someone who had stopped reaching for me long before I'd stopped reaching back. I sat at my vanity and removed my earrings slowly, watching myself in the mirror as if trying to spot the version of me that used to believe in connection. She was hard to find. I reached for the book. Opened it. Read another chapter. This one spoke of spaces between people. How they start as small pauses, missed opportunities for touch or laughter, and grow quietly into entire distances. How those gaps widen until they're not bridges anymore, they're chasms. I set the book down. Then I did something I hadn't done since the park. I messaged him. I don't know what this is. But I can't keep pretending nothing's changing. The reply came a few minutes later. I'm not asking for anything from you. But I won't lie, I think about you. More than I should. The words sat on my screen like a line I couldn't uncross. But I didn't delete them. The next morning, I found a note in the mailbox. Handwritten. No envelope. Just one sentence. Let's not hide in silence anymore. I read it 3 times, then folded it slowly and tucked it into the same place as before, between pages that understood me better than most people did. That afternoon, he stopped by. He had left something behind from the faucet repair, a wrench or screwdriver, I don't remember. I handed it to him at the door. Our fingers didn't touch, but something passed between us anyway. An understanding. An ache. A question. He didn't linger. He didn't need to. Because I knew what would come next. And that evening, after dinner, after the dishes, after my husband said goodnight and went to bed with his usual half-smile and distant kiss on the forehead, I sat alone in the living room. The candle from the night before had melted down to the stub. The house was quiet again. And still, my heart wasn't. I woke up before dawn, the sky outside still deep with indigo shadows. The house was silent, wrapped in a hush that felt heavier than rest. I stared at the ceiling for a long while, arms crossed over my chest as if I were holding myself together. My husband was beside me, his breathing steady, unaware of the thoughts spiraling just inches from him. I wondered if he could sense it, the shift. If he noticed how I'd stopped reaching for his hand in the dark. How I no longer turned toward him when he moved beside me. But maybe we had both grown too accustomed to absence to feel its weight anymore. I slipped out of bed quietly, the floor cool beneath my feet. In the kitchen, I made tea and leaned against the counter while it steeped. My hands wrapped around the mug, not for warmth but for something to anchor me. A routine gesture. A small ritual to prove that this life, as quiet and fractured as it had become, was still mine. But something had changed. Not loud or dramatic, but undeniably. The notes. The words left between pages and in mailboxes. The looks that lingered longer than they should. The feeling of being seen, truly seen, after so long in the shadows. Later that morning, I stood in front of my closet again. My fingers hovered over the navy dress, then past it. I chose something else, simple, soft, familiar. I wasn't dressing to be noticed. I was dressing to feel present. For myself. For what the day might bring. I didn't have a plan. That wasn't unusual. My days rarely followed any structure. But instead of losing time in chores or errands, I found myself walking. Not fast. Not with intention. Just walking, as if I might find something outside that would clarify the mess unraveling inside me. By noon, I ended up downtown, in front of the bookstore I used to visit often years ago. I hadn't stepped inside in ages. It used to be a place of quiet escape, rows of stories, corners of stillness, strangers immersed in pages that made them feel understood. I missed that. The simplicity of being alone among words. I wandered inside, letting my fingers trace the spines without reading the titles. The scent of paper and dust settled in my chest like memory. I picked up a novel I hadn't heard of, turned to the first page, and read 3 lines before I had to stop. Not because of the story, but because the emotion that surfaced had caught me off guard. I bought the book and left. Outside, I sat on a bench and opened to the second page. I didn't read it. Instead, I tucked something inside, the note I had written the night before. It felt strange, placing it in a book for no one in particular. But it also felt necessary. A private kind of honesty. A silent confession. You are allowed to want more. You are allowed to be more. The words repeated in my mind like a gentle drumbeat, each syllable a permission I hadn't given myself in years. On the way home, I saw him again. He was walking in the opposite direction, his gaze distracted, a small brown bag from the corner cafe in hand. Our eyes met. He paused. I did too. There was a beat of quiet. Then another. I spoke first. You always walk this way? He nodded. Only when I hoped to run into someone. The reply wasn't flirtatious. It wasn't calculated. It was just honest. I nodded. My heart thudded, not with fear, but with recognition. He wasn't asking for anything. He never had. But the truth between us no longer felt contained. We stood there for another moment. A street away from anything familiar. Then I said, let's walk. We didn't say much. Our steps matched easily. We passed people and buildings, turned corners without thinking. It was the kind of walk you take with someone you don't need to perform for. The kind where silence is comfortable. Eventually, we reached a quiet part of the park, the far side, where the benches were worn and the trees shaded everything in dappled light. He gestured to sit. We did. I told myself I wouldn't bring it up. That I wouldn't mention the kiss. That I wouldn't open a door I might not know how to close. But I did. I think about that day. A lot more than I want to. His expression didn't change. But his voice was softer than I expected. Me too. I looked down at my hands, folded neatly in my lap like I was at a confession. Then I asked what had been lodged in the back of my throat for weeks. Do you regret it? He took a long breath. No. I regret that it matters as much as it does. That answer gutted me more than any apology could have. Because I understood it completely. We didn't touch. We didn't speak again for several minutes. Birds moved in the trees above us, wind rattled the leaves, and the world continued as though nothing had happened. But everything had. Before we parted, he turned to me. I won't reach for you again. Unless you ask me to. I nodded. Not as agreement. Not as refusal. Just as acknowledgement that I had heard him. I walked home slowly, the late afternoon sun soft against my skin. Inside the house, everything was as I had left it. Tidy. Predictable. Quiet. My husband was upstairs, working. I could hear the faint click of keys. The sound used to bring comfort, routine, stability. Now it only reminded me how far we had drifted. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my new book, and pulled out the note I had hidden inside it earlier that day. I unfolded it. Read it again. You are allowed to want more. You are allowed to be more. I left it on the table. Not to be found. But to remind myself. In my own home. In my own life. That I was still here. Still wanting. Still allowed. The next morning unfolded slowly, like a fog that refused to lift. I moved through the kitchen quietly, letting the kettle boil too long, pouring water that tasted of metal and memory. My husband's coffee mug still sat in the sink from the night before, his tie draped over the back of a chair, his schedule scrawled on the notepad near the fridge. All the details of his presence were there. And yet, I felt more alone than I had in days. I had started to notice that loneliness wasn't about physical absence. It was about being unseen in plain sight. And in this house, I was invisible behind open doors. I spent the day drifting from one chore to another without ever finishing anything. The laundry stayed in the basket, the mail unopened on the hallway table. I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts circled one thing, one person, one moment that had not faded with time but sharpened. I watched the clock move through its slow procession toward evening. With each hour, I felt my heart press more firmly against something unspoken. I had made promises to myself. Boundaries. Rules I thought I'd hold on to no matter how lonely I became. But promises built on pain don't always stand. As the sun dropped behind the rooftops, my phone buzzed once. His name. A message. I'm here if you want to talk. Or not talk. Just not be alone. The simplicity of it unraveled me. I sat on the couch for nearly an hour, staring at the message, reading it again and again. There was no pressure in his words. No expectation. Just presence. Something I hadn't truly felt in my own home for far too long. Eventually, I rose. I didn't change clothes or do my makeup. I didn't rehearse a speech or justify my reasons. I simply walked. Out the door, down the street, under the heavy dusk sky. When I arrived at his porch, the door was already open. He didn't speak. Neither did I. We just looked at each other, two people caught in a moment where silence said everything. I stepped inside. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. There were no sweeping gestures, no desperate gasps. Just stillness. Warmth. Recognition. He led me to the kitchen. Offered tea. I shook my head. My voice was gone, not from fear, but from the weight of what this meant. We sat opposite each other at the table, the kind of table where real things are said. We didn't speak for a long time. I watched the way his hands curled around the edge of his mug. I noticed how his shoulders relaxed, not from comfort, but from honesty. Like he was no longer holding anything in. Finally, I said the only thing I knew how to say. I don't know what I'm doing. He nodded. That makes two of us. There was no pretense. No need to dress it up. This wasn't about fantasy or escape. It was about something far more complicated, a connection formed not out of thrill, but out of truth. He didn't reach for me. I didn't reach for him. But we sat there, side by side, as the minutes melted into hours, and I felt something settle in me that hadn't been still in a long time. When the clock hit midnight, I stood. We didn't make promises. We didn't make plans. I looked at him once more, memorizing his face in the soft kitchen light, and then I walked to the door. Just before I stepped outside, I paused. I turned to him. And then, we spent the night together. When I returned home the next morning, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale gold hue across the living room floor. Everything looked the same. The keys still hung by the door. My husband's briefcase still rested by the stairs. The house was untouched, as if the world had paused in my absence. But I hadn't. I stood for a long time in the hallway, unsure whether to head upstairs or stay where I was. I could hear movement, he was awake. I imagined him brushing his teeth, adjusting his tie, glancing at his phone. Eventually, I climbed the stairs. He stood at the bedroom door, already dressed. He looked at me, eyes trailing slowly across my face, my clothes, my presence. He didn't ask where I'd been. He didn't need to. We stared at each other across that narrow stretch of carpet, and something between us cracked. But it didn't break. Not yet. He walked past me, down the stairs, and out the door. And I stood there, alone again, but for the first time, no longer pretending I didn't know why. The hours after he left passed like slow-moving shadows, stretching longer than they should, refusing to let go. I stayed in the hallway for a while, still in the clothes I had worn the night before, unable to decide what to do with myself. The air inside the house felt heavy, as if it knew something had shifted, though nothing had moved. I didn't cry. Not from guilt. Not from confusion. But from the weight of recognition. I had always believed betrayal was defined by action, by a moment that could be named. But it wasn't. It was a slow erosion. A drift. A truth ignored until it could no longer be. By mid-morning, I found myself in the kitchen, staring at a loaf of bread that had gone stale. I had no appetite, yet I spread butter across a slice and ate it slowly, not because I wanted to, but because it felt like proof that I was still here. Still tethered to something. My husband hadn't called. I hadn't expected him to. He was never the kind of man who confronted emotion head-on. His silences had always been longer than his sentences. Even in our early years, when love was loud and laughter easy, there had been a quiet wall he built around certain parts of himself. I used to think I could climb it. That, in time, I'd find a way through. But the truth was, I had learned to live on my side of it. Around noon, I walked into the bedroom and sat at the edge of the bed. The sheets were still messy from the night before, though not from closeness. From distance. We hadn't shared warmth in weeks. Maybe longer. I picked up the book from my nightstand, the one that had started everything. Its spine was worn now. Dog-eared pages, folded corners. Inside, the two notes still rested, his and mine. I read them both again. You deserve to be seen. You are allowed to want more. They no longer felt like confessions. They felt like acknowledgments. And acknowledgments had consequences. In the late afternoon, I wandered outside, needing movement. I didn't go far, just around the block, past the same houses I saw every day, their familiarity both comforting and suffocating. The neighbor's porch was empty. Curtains drawn. I didn't expect to see him. Part of me hoped I wouldn't. I wasn't ready to face what we had done, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. Too well. When I returned home, the house was still empty. But something was different. A quiet, not just of sound but of expectation. I walked to the living room, and on the coffee table, I found a note. It wasn't long. I saw your face this morning. You didn't look sorry. Just tired. I don't know what to do with that. There was no name at the bottom. There didn't need to be. I folded the paper slowly, carefully, like it might shatter in my hands. I placed it inside the book, with the others. 3 pieces of truth now layered between pages. A growing archive of what had broken between us. That night, we didn't speak. He came home late. Took a shower. Went to bed without a word. I followed hours later, moving quietly in the dark, careful not to disturb him, though there was nothing left between us that could be disturbed. I lay awake long after the house had gone still. I thought about everything. The way it had begun with a knock at the door. A loaf of banana bread. A glance held too long. I hadn't meant to fall. I had meant to feel. To breathe. To remember what it was like to be someone. And in doing so, I had become someone else entirely. The next morning, I wrote a letter. Not to him. Not to the man who had kissed me in the park or held space for me in the quiet of his kitchen. To my husband. I didn't explain everything. I didn't confess details. But I told the truth. That I felt alone. That I had felt it for years. That I had tried to reach for him and stopped when I realized he wasn't reaching back. That I didn't know if we could fix what we had lost, or even if we wanted to. I left the letter on his pillow before going out. I walked again. Through the neighborhood, through the park, past the bench where everything had started to change. I didn't sit. I wasn't looking for answers. When I returned, he wasn't home. But the letter was gone. And beside it, on the nightstand, was his wedding ring. Placed there gently. Deliberately. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't cry. I just sat down on the edge of the bed, hands folded in my lap, and exhaled for the first time in what felt like weeks. Not in relief. But in honesty. There was no undoing what had been done. Only moving forward. Whatever that would mean. The ring sat there like a question I had no answer for. I didn't touch it, didn't move it. Just stared at the way the light caught its edge, the way something so small could suddenly feel so loud. I thought about all the times he had worn it, on vacations, at family dinners, when we used to hold hands under the table. It had once been a promise. Now it was a punctuation mark. And I wasn't sure if it ended the sentence or started a new one. The letter I had written was gone. Whether he had read it or simply taken it with him, I didn't know. But the absence of his ring told me what I needed to understand: something had shifted. And even if he didn't say it, he had answered in his own way. The rest of the day passed in slow, disjointed pieces. I tried to distract myself, folded laundry, swept the kitchen floor, watered the plant in the hallway that had long since stopped blooming. But everything felt mechanical. My body moved, but my thoughts stayed in one place. In the early afternoon, I stood by the window for what must have been an hour, watching the street, not waiting for anyone in particular. Just existing in that strange space between shock and clarity. It's a place people rarely talk about, when you're not sad yet, not relieved either. Just awake. More awake than you want to be. I found myself walking again, unsure why, drawn to movement because stillness felt unbearable. My feet led me to the edge of the park, though I didn't go in. I stood near the entrance, fingers tight in the sleeves of my sweater, eyes following a mother pushing a stroller, a boy chasing a squirrel, two women laughing on a bench. The world, still spinning. Eventually, I turned and kept walking, this time past his house. There were no lights on. No movement behind the curtains. No note. No sign. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. Back at home, I made tea I didn't drink, opened a book I didn't read. My eyes kept drifting back to the ring. Still where he left it. I thought about moving it, placing it in a drawer or back in its box. But something held me still. Maybe I needed it there. To remind me that what was broken didn't shatter all at once. That it had been cracking quietly for years, and I just hadn't looked closely enough. That night, I went to bed early, the room darker than usual. I left the curtains open. Let the moonlight fall across the sheets. I didn't expect him to come home. And he didn't. I woke at dawn to silence, the kind that presses into your ears until it becomes sound itself. I showered, dressed, and made breakfast out of habit. The toast burned. I ate it anyway. At 9, the doorbell rang. I froze, toast still in my hand, butter knife mid-air. My heart ticked faster than my thoughts. When I opened the door, he stood there. Not my husband. The other him. His expression was unreadable, calm, but not empty. I stepped aside without a word. He didn't hesitate. In the kitchen, we sat across from each other, the table between us suddenly feeling very small. I didn't know if I should come, he said after a long pause. I didn't know if I wanted you to, I replied. We both looked away. He took a breath, hands folded tightly. I didn't mean for this to happen. Not like this. I know. The words hung there, not as blame, not as apology, but as recognition. What we had stepped into wasn't about desire. It was about what had been missing from our lives: space, honesty, presence. He hesitated, then asked, "Did he read it?" "I think so," I said. He didn't say anything. But the ring's on the nightstand. He nodded slowly. There was no triumph in his face. No satisfaction. Just sadness. Understanding. Maybe even guilt. Not for what we had shared, but for what it had meant. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something settle. Not regret. Not longing. Something closer to truth. This was never about you, I said quietly. Not really. He nodded. I know. And it was never just about him either. For the first time in weeks, I felt a stillness in my chest. A quiet that didn't ache. We had crossed lines, yes. But we had also uncovered something that had lived beneath the surface for years, a deep hunger to be seen, to be understood, to be real. We talked for a while longer. Not about the future. Not about love. Just about life. The kind of conversation two people have when they know they're standing at a threshold neither one of them is meant to cross again. Before he left, he said one last thing. I hope you find what you've been looking for. Whether it's with him or without either of us. I walked him to the door. Watched him go. And then, for the first time since this began, I let myself cry. Not from shame. Not from heartbreak. But because I was finally ready to start telling the truth. Even if I wasn't sure yet what it would sound like. The house felt different now. Not emptier, exactly, just quieter in a way that wasn't waiting to be filled. As if something had been released from the walls, something heavy that had clung there for too long. I could move through the rooms again without feeling like I was trespassing in my own life. The silence that had once suffocated now simply existed, like furniture or shadows. It didn't ask anything of me. It didn't judge. He didn't come home that night. And for the first time, I didn't wonder where he was. Instead, I let myself be still. I turned on a lamp in the corner of the living room, the soft yellow light curling along the bookshelves. I sat on the couch with my knees pulled close, a blanket across my lap. I wasn't reading or writing. Just breathing. Just being. That night, I slept with the window open. The cool air crept in slowly, brushing against my skin like a reminder that I was still part of the world, even if I hadn't felt like it for a long time. Sleep came gradually, not as an escape but as a kind of surrender. And when I woke with the first light of morning, it was the first time I didn't feel dread waiting at the edge of my bed. There was no note on the kitchen table. No text. No explanation. But I knew he had read the letter. And I knew that the absence of a response was a response in itself. Some people leave loudly, with slammed doors and final words. Others leave quietly, 1 inch at a time, until all that's left is the echo. In the days that followed, I began clearing drawers. Not out of anger. Not to erase him. But to make space. Space to move, to breathe, to begin again, even if I didn't yet know what again would look like. I folded shirts he hadn't worn in months. Sorted through receipts and papers and birthday cards signed with love that had slowly worn thin. I left his ring where he'd placed it. It wasn't mine to touch. Instead, I opened the book again, the one that had carried so many small truths between its pages. The notes were still there. 3 now. I read them all again, one by one. Each a version of a voice I hadn't allowed myself to hear. His. Mine. Ours. I added a fourth. Not to be shared. Not to be read. Just to be written. Asterisk sometimes, love doesn't die. It simply changes shape. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is let it asterisk. I tucked it between the others and closed the book. That afternoon, I visited my sister for the first time in months. We sat on her back porch while her kids played in the yard. She didn't ask why I had finally come. She didn't press. She just poured me tea, handed me a slice of lemon, and said, "I'm glad you're here." And I was. We talked about ordinary things, her job, the dog, a new neighbor who played the trumpet too loud at night. And I listened with a kind of attention I hadn't realized I'd lost. The world was still out there, pulsing with motion and noise, and I had been standing just outside of it. Now, I was stepping back in, even if slowly. In the evening, when I returned home, the lights were still off. No car in the driveway. I wasn't surprised. I no longer flinched at the quiet. I made a small dinner, set only one plate. I ate without rushing, each bite grounded in the moment. The fork on the edge of the plate. The soft hum of the refrigerator. The way the light dimmed as the sun dipped past the windows. After dinner, I went for a walk. I passed the park. The bench. I didn't sit. There was no need to retrace every step of what had happened. I knew the story. I had lived it. What mattered now wasn't reliving it, it was choosing what came next. I walked past his house, saw the curtain drawn back just slightly, a shadow moving inside. He didn't come out. I didn't stop. There was nothing left to say, and that in itself was a kind of closure. The night air was cool against my skin. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime sang softly. And I realized something I hadn't dared hope for. I felt peace. Not joy, not yet. But peace. The kind that settles when you've finally told the truth, when you've finally stopped running from yourself. Back home, I turned off the lights and lit a candle instead. Just one. I sat beside it, watching the flame flicker, its rhythm slow and certain. I thought about everything I'd lost. Everything I'd discovered. Everything I might become. I didn't know what would happen next. But I no longer needed to.